On Sunday, the 23rd of February 2025, Hassan Nasrallah, the former head of Hezbollah, had his funeral in Beirut. He had been assassinated by Israel on the 27th of September 2024. And that was a couple of days after my birthday, on which I received this lovely bottle of Scotch, which we'll speak about in a bit. But when the news of his death reached the broader Middle East in September 2024, there was an outburst of rejoicing and celebrations and truly amazing displays. In fact, in Israel, they started replaying clips from this song from several decades ago.
The question then that we asked ourselves really was, should the Jews have been celebrating? Should we have been rejoicing, dancing in the streets, handing out sweets, especially given the aftermath of pogroms of October 7th, after this absolute horrors that we've been living through? Should we rejoice when someone like Hassan Nasrallah or indeed Sinwar were killed and were made to meet their maker? That was the question that we began to discuss. Welcome to the Academy Conversation, or Two Jews and a Scotch.
The idea of two Jews and a Scotch emerged over the past couple of years when at the Academy we wondered to ourselves where in the public space was a genuine Torah discourse happening. Because of course, in the Torah world, what is holy beyond anything is a machloket l'shem shamayim, an argument for the sake of heaven, where there's acknowledgement that there are two or more sides to a really thoughtful engagement on any topic. So in Two Jews and a Scotch, you'll have two opinions. And here's the catch. We've flipped a coin prior to each session, and one of us will take one side of the discussion and the other will have to take the other. You will not know until the following segment which of us really believed what. And that's really the point. Because in a Torah space, each of the views has a certain amount of validity. On any page of Gemara, the machloket honors both sides of the discussion and tries to understand each and plumb the depths of each one. We also hope that you'll enjoy taking some of these ideas along with the notes and the source sheets we've created and maybe sharing them with friends and family around a Shabbat table. Of course, the Scotch part is because we have a fantastic Scotch in every session, which we'll sample as we go along. We really hope that you enjoy and share.
Great. So on that note, shall we pour the Scotch?
Yes, that's poured already.
Oh, it's poured. Fantastic.
You clearly have been drinking already.
Well, in that case, we'll begin with maybe a discussion of what Scotch this is.
Fantastic.
Even though we are not necessarily being sponsored.
Yes. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'akol niyeh bidvaro.
Amen.
As I said, I got this for my birthday. This is produced by an Israeli distillery, M&H, Milk and Honey. It's their sherry cask elements. I love it. And it won the best single malt award in the world. So I highly recommend it. And as Ilana said, we're not getting sponsored by anyone. So anything we say about the Scotch is true to form. L'chaim, and enjoy the discussion. So let's just put some context in place. Nasrallah's funeral took place on the 23rd of February, and he led Hezbollah, a terrorist organization acknowledged as such by many countries, not by South Africa, killed many innocents, built up the world's largest non-state actor army, huge amounts of drones and missiles, suicide bombers, the whole lot. And Israel assassinated him last year, 2024. And across the Middle East, so many people had been oppressed by Hezbollah, not just in Lebanon, but even in Iran, where Hezbollah helped the Iranians to quell dissidents. And when these events were reported, so many of these victims just handed out sweets and rejoiced. And the question that we're going to deal with is, should we be rejoicing at the deaths of our enemies, particularly given what's happened since October 7th, before and after. I'll be taking the side that we should be rejoicing, and Ilana will be taking the side that we should not. Ilana, ladies first. What's your point?
Okay, so let's think about this. To be honest, when I saw people celebrating, handing out sweets, I found that a little bit uncomfortable. And I started to think, well, what do our sources say? Do we have precedent for rejoicing or indeed not rejoicing? And actually, the first real precedent, I guess you could say, that we have is in the Gemara in Sanhedrin on page 39b, which is discussing various different ideas in terms of justice. And it quotes the verse in Proverbs that says that when the wicked perish, there is song. So that sounds like we absolutely should celebrate. And Rabbi Acha Bar Chanina says that, in fact, when Achav ben Omri, who was a very wicked king in Israel, perished, there was song. But, asks the Gemara on this point, when the Holy One, blessed he, was he gladdened, or is he gladdened by the downfall of the wicked? Because is it not written? And here the Gemara goes on to talk about really what happens at the Red Sea. When we have as we know, the Jewish people get to the Red Sea, it splits, they walk across, and then the Egyptians duly follow and are covered over by the water and are destroyed. The Egyptian army is completely destroyed and drowned. And it seems, though, that at this point, the angels begin to celebrate. And they're singing, and God turns to them and says, my handiwork. In other words, the Egyptians are drowning in the sea, and you are reciting a song before me. So it sounds like God, in fact, is not happy to have celebration when even evil people are destroyed, because these are indeed God's creations. So I think that's one particular point that we have there. And in fact, the Midrash Haminu has something similar, and in which case actually quotes an opposite pasuk, the opposite verse in the book of Proverbs, 24:17 in this case, which says something completely different to the one quoted in the Gemara, which is, at the downfall of your enemy, do not rejoice. Do not rejoice. And this is where the Midrash, in fact, also brings that the angels sought to sing God's praises, and God said, the work of my hands drown in the sea, and you wish to sing songs before me. And therefore discusses the fact that when it comes to Hallel, as we know, on the first 2 days of Pesach, or one in Israel, we say full Hallel, but after that we only say half Hallel, particularly on the seventh day, which is in fact the commemoration of the splitting of the sea. So we don't say full Hallel. There is therefore precedent to say that if there is rejoicing, it is held back, and that God himself is not so keen. What do you say to that, Rav Ramon?
So firstly, thank you for presenting those ideas. I think when we look at the Gemara, you've tactfully omitted the last bit of the Gemara, which the Gemara says, you're right, that Hashem himself doesn't rejoice over the destruction of the wicked, but he causes other people to rejoice, others to rejoice. And you clearly see that the Gemara is positing that there's a split between God's perspective and our perspective. Now, often, when one is encountering terrible situations, God forbid you're in a house of Shiva, people raise this idea that really from God's perspective, things are for the best and for the better. The various analogies are given that, you're seeing the tapestry from the other side. And if you see it from the reverse angle, it all looks like a mess, but if you turn it around, it looks perfect. And I think that the Torah, in all respects, both in the revealed and the hidden, in the Kabbalah, endorses this idea that Hashem does have a different perspective from us. And that, indeed, Hashem doesn't rejoice, but that he is happy for others to, or causes others to rejoice. And I think the Gemara is asking us to actually think about the fact that at certain points in time, we shouldn't behave at that level. Maybe it's an ideal, maybe it's something only Hashem can do. But that on our level, we should, and I think the simplest example is what you've quoted already, the Jews singing at the sea, because they get out the sea and they sing a song. And if we read in the Psukim over there, we say it every day, as Yashir, in the morning davening, and it's right over there in the Torah. They sing a song and they actually go through very happily how the Egyptians died. Some of them died like straw, some of them sank like lead, stones, and they seem to be very much rejoicing that their enemies were dead. But I think the core question that we need to deal with is not just to look at textual or historical precedents, but to look at what would motivate it. And when I say that we should rejoice, I'm going to talk about the very pasuk that you quoted from Mishlei, that when the wicked perish, Mishlei Yud Aleph, pasuk Yud, chapter 11, verse 10, that when the wicked perish, there's joy or there's singing. And why would we do that? So the Vilna Gaon, in his commentary over there, he says, at the end of the day, there are a couple of precedents that happened in Egypt, happened in Purim with Haman, which we are now going towards. And we'll speak about that in a bit. But the Vilna Gaon says that there's a process that God uses when dealing with evil in the world. And that's what we're dealing with. We're living in an age where you can't be judgmental, as Rabbi Sachs says, and you're not allowed to make judgments. And his response was, no, we don't need to be judgmental, but we still need to keep our sense of judgment. And what we've seen over the past 2-3 years is an inversion of wrong and right and of justice and of the concept of truth. We've got now more October 7th deniers than Holocaust deniers. And people essentially attempting to rewrite history a day after it's being made and filmed by the very evildoers perpetrating the evil. And therefore, we need to be looking at this from the perspective of God's plan unfolding in the world in a measured process of justice being brought into the world. And that's what we need to be rejoicing about. And if we don't rejoice about that, we're playing into the whole space where everything goes. It's all postmodern. And we don't have a wrong and a right. And your opinion is your opinion. We're not going to do that. We need to take a very firm line and we need to say, no, there is wrong, there is right. We need to work towards right and we need to eradicate wrong. And when we actually have a very rare victory, we need to celebrate that, not because we're happy about a particular individual dying, but because we want to make sure that our community, at the very least, has those lines very clear and that we feel a sense of resonance with God's plan.
Great. So I think then what we can see is those two different verses from Mishlei actually come to balance each other out in a sense, because they seem to contradict, but they don't contradict if we understand them to say evil must be seen, and then it must be seen in a way that we need to react to it, that when it is killed, there is song. That really brings then the two kind of together. I would say that that's the way I view it, and I would say that we're explicitly focusing. The celebration is focusing on God's role in making this happen. Right. That this has happened by divine providence, which is why I say we should make a big simcha about it. And I think now I'm gonna raise a point which I want you to bet on is Purim itself. So Purim itself, the whole chag, the whole festival, seems to be in my court. You have this attempted genocide, which doesn't come off, thank God. The Jews then go on the offensive or the defensive, however you want to read it. Our enemies will say offensive. We'll say it's defensive. They manage to get hold of all of these anti-Semites who are going to destroy us and kill us. And after that, we have not just one day of feasting, but now generations thereof, where you have a Su'udah, a feast which you have to have on Purim, and you read the Megillah once at night, once in the day, you give out sweets to people and gifts to your friends and to the poor. Now, that essentially seems to be a massive public, constant rejoicing. And I'm going to throw it out there. Maybe, at some point in time, we need to look at making a day like that here, post October 7th, where we make I don't know what you call it, Purim 2. It's interesting because Purim, at the end of the day,
the people who were driving it were Iranian. They were Persians. Okay. Now,
ironies.
The ironies, right? Ironies of this whole thing.
You're allowed one.
Thank you. So I'm going to say that at the end of the day, we should definitely make that. And I've got 2 points to think about over here. Firstly, I get what you're saying about Hashem saying, my creatures are dying, how do you rejoice? That's not an ideal. You never want to have to get there. You never want the world to be in a space where death or war is the way you solve things. And I think that Gemara is really sensitizing in that. I also think, though, that maybe there's an element not just of rejoicing, but of relief. And maybe we don't feel it as much in the diaspora where we didn't suffer it. But in Israel, where everyone has been affected by this, I think that may also be different. So maybe you might say, look, in Chutz La'aretz, in the diaspora, you can't rejoice because you haven't felt that sword literally sitting on your neck. And even in Israel, the very least, surely you have to admit that at least expressing a sense of relief is appropriate. Even if you want to say, don't rejoice, don't have a full-on party, but surely relief, the sense of we've been saved, something like that, that is appropriate.
Okay. I do think it could be appropriate, but I think, and I want to go back to the fact that there were parties, and there's the party of Purim. So should one go that far? In other words, should one party? Should one absolutely rejoice ad lo yada, right? Is that really where one should go? And I'd like to point out a couple of issues I have with that. And I think that
so
going down...
you're saying we shouldn't make our party day post-October 7th, Purim 2?
I'm saying that I'm not sure that it should go to a party.
Your party worries
There
you.
may be praise.
Okay.
There may be praise. There may be relief. But I'm not sure that party is where we should be going. That utter and unbelievable joy to that extent is where we should be going.
But why do we do Purim then?
So it's an interesting point. Why do we have a party on Purim? I think, and this is something that Rabbi Dr. Chaim Angel of Yeshiva University speaks about, is if we take a look at where the Simcha takes place in the Megillah, it's quite interesting. It doesn't take place, if you look at the end where Haman is hanged. When Haman is hanged, when you look at, well, what's the response, you'll notice that from the Jewish people, there's a deafening silence. There is no response on that. All that happens there is a response from Achashverosh. Achashverosh is very happy. He feels very relieved, actually, that Haman is dead because he just thought Haman's after his wife and, that's really where he goes. But there's nothing from the Jews. The Jews only are happy a little bit later. Esther has had to go back to Achashverosh, has had to plead again for some kind of reprieve from the genocide, because the truth is that with the death of Haman, there is just a little reprieve. That's all. And the reprieve is just from the guy who started the whole process. That's all. But the problem is that the thing carries on. The threat of genocide is still alive and well. So it is only once Mordechai gets the king's ring, actually, and therefore the power of the king to create a new decree that says that the Jews can defend themselves. When that, call it narrative, changes, that is then the moment of rejoicing. So the party is not about the death of Haman, is where I'm going.
So you'd want the United Nations to stand up in public and say, we're so sorry, we're going to let you defend yourselves.
Look, I'm not asking for big miracles here, okay? Just a little one.
Okay, so you're saying then that the party is only when? After the self-defense and the threat of genocide has been completely removed.
Or has been mitigated to the point where we can now defend ourselves. That's all that's happened, actually, at that point. And then the party is when we win that battle, which admittedly did involve the death, presumably, of a bunch of anti-Semites.
But that's not the point.
That's not the point, yes.
So my understanding of what you're saying then is that you can't have a party about the death of an instigator, no matter how large that personality is. That's the problem. that would...
That's not precedent, is what I'm saying. You can't use
but
that
not
as
just the precedent, but the problem. You're going
Yes.
beyond that. You're saying
Yes.
that at the end of the day, you would concede to my points about acknowledging Hashem's role and divine providence and the
100%.
justice, the right and wrong, getting rid of the postmodernism. But you don't want it linked to a particular death, a particular personality.
Right.
You want it linked to the phenomenon and Hashem saving us, or at least giving us the tools to save ourselves
Correct.
from. And I suppose this is linked to the fact that in the Megillah, Hashem's not evident.
Yes.
Well, Hashem's hand is hidden.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
And that I think to a certain extent resonates very strongly here, because I suppose that a lot of us are asking October 7th, where was God?
Right.
And on Purim, everyone was asking, where was God?
Presumably, exactly.
And they turn around and say, God, how have you abandoned us? We're going to be all murdered. And there's this tremendous black, so that God's name is never mentioned in the Megillah. And then only afterwards, and people don't realize this, but the whole story of the Megillah takes 13 years. And
Exactly.
eventually, only 13 years later, you see the Yeshua. So you're saying that that's when the party happens, and it happens on the Yeshua, not on the, I suppose, particular tiny, not tiny or not so tiny, milestones along the way, even the death of the instigator.
Even the death of the instigator. Correct. Correct.
Okay.
So really, if you think about it, then where we began was more about looking at things from God's eyes versus ours.
Yeah.
We could say that. Then looking at it maybe from a contextual point of view, and where that particular rejoicing could or could not take place or should not take place. And I'd like to then go to ourselves, really, in a sense, and look at it from just our own point of view. When I rejoice over the death of an evil person, what is it? What else might be happening when this happens? So this is something I want internally, and maybe let's call it metaphysically. And I'll show you what I mean.
Okay.
There's an interesting point in Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers, chapter 4, section 20, which says, Shmuel HaKatan says, when your enemy falls, do not rejoice. Let your heart not be glad when he stumbles. And this is that verse from Mishlei, again, from Proverbs. So don't rejoice. Why not, says Shmuel HaKatan? Lest God see and it be evil in his eyes, and he deflect his anger from him. So what I find really interesting about this then is that when I rejoice to that extent about the death of a person, it almost activates a sense of mercy or something in God, on God's creation, even though this person was evil, and God is suddenly feeling a little sorry for this evil person, and therefore it's maybe even almost an Ein Horror that happens here.
Or a reverse
right?
Ein Horror.
Or a reverse Ein Horror,
Ein
exactly.
Tova on a bad person.
Where God now goes, maybe you should just cool your jets a little, because actually this is still perhaps my creation, or whatever the thinking may be going on. Of course, we don't understand really where God's thinking is going there. But the point is that by my rejoicing, something has changed in simply death of an evil person, justice, and now though I've added another angle in that might change the way that things are now seen by God, and therefore what might happen to me. So
I think, again, I've got a couple of responses to that. Even taking into account what you've said till now, I'm going to argue again that that's fine from God's side. But as the Gemara in Brachot says, Hanei Kaf Shedrachmana, those are the secret things of Hashem. How Hashem's behind-the-scenes justice processes work, should I be attempting to fiddle around with those? The Beit Yosef in the beginning of Orach Chaim, he says a different point on this. He says that he's concerned of how it impacts our personality. That there's certain midot that if a person, certain character traits that if a person uses, that they will, as he says, they'll make a kinyan in his personality forever. So he gives the example of aggression. If a person encourages his own level of aggression and begins to act aggressively, even if it's initially for good, that eventually becomes part of his or her nature, and then they behave that way even not in the circumstances which is for the good, but simply because he or she has habituated him or herself to be aggressive generally. And I think you could, your question you could ask over here that I can think about is, and maybe this talks to how you would celebrate, but are we encouraging a sense of desensitivity towards human life? And this, here you could say,
which would be my point.
I could hear that. But I do think, and I'm preempting it, I'm saying that to a certain extent, it's a question of how you celebrate it. So if I go back to your very first point, which is the angels are singing, and how can you sing praise? So the Beit Yosef, again, in the Orach Chaim, in Taf Tzadi, he says, bringing the Shibboleh Leket, that's why we don't say full Hallel for the last couple of days of Pesach, because of this midrash, that we can't praise Hashem fully over the last days of Pesach, because the Egyptians are drowning. So there's a mitigation. So my argument to you is, okay, so you don't want a full party, and you don't get completely inebriated, until it's after the event, like on Purim. I get it. But you still then have some element of celebration. It's just not a full celebration. It's chatzi halal, it's half halal. It's half a celebration. I mean, I didn't pour the full glass of my M&H sherry cask whiskey. I have a quarter. I don't get totally inebriated. I think that you have something to say over there. And I think it talks to this point as well. The question of how you celebrate it. And I think if you look at Purim, I think it's a good example. So, the focus of Purim is not to go around laughing at the death of Haman, and that's not the focus of it, right. Or the death of his sons, or the death of the anti-Semites. So the focus is on that Hashem saved us. As I said before, Hashem saved us. Hashem's providence was involved, even though we didn't see him, even though his name is not in the Megillah. And similarly here, October 7th onwards, the same. It's really interesting. We're working at the moment on translating Rav Amital's book, my Rosh Hashiva, Rav Yehuda Amital, the first book he ever wrote, in the wake of the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And he speaks about what he saw in Israeli society post-1967. And post-1967 was exactly this. In the lead up to 1967, the Six-Day War, Israelis thought they would be massacred. They thought there was going to be an impending Holocaust. There were plans made to take children out of Israel. They dug graves. There was this mass sense that this was literally do or die. And he speaks about how people felt immediately when they were saved, and then as time passed, what changed.
Right.
And he says that there was a deep sense, especially after both of those wars, of people seeing God's hand, but that vanished very, very quickly. Very, very quickly. And I think you could have a point about a celebration that focuses on cruelty and that sort of stuff. Get it? I would say then let's try to find a way to celebrate things that don't concretize that element and desensitization towards life, but rather sensitization to the fact that we've made it out and that God saved us and that we were this close. And I really believe on October 7th we were this close. I think that the Iranian general plan was that there would be an attack from simultaneously the Houthis in the south, the Iranians, the Hezbollah, and Hamas. If that had happened, none of us know what would have occurred. And that then I'll concede to you that maybe we don't focus on the deaths of the particular person, but maybe we choose that day right. as the day for a broader celebration. Or
interesting.
Yeah.
So, okay, that would work. I just want to add, though, one other angle here, and that is, if we were to choose that day then, which is the day of the death of someone, okay, right. of a very evil person, if that's the day we chose, I'm not sure that we would be laying an emphasis on death. A bit of an undue emphasis on death, as well as a little bit of, I think this is problematic when it comes to character, to our own refinement of character. Because at the end of the day, everything we do, all our actions are there, and the mitzvot, for example, are there to refine us, to create better people, right? I mean, amongst, yes, listening to God, etc., of course, but it's also about something else. And for example, and I want to bring actually Avram Grozinski, who says it, I think, quite well when he talks about this idea about whether one can sing at the destruction of the wicked. He adds a note of warning, and I think it's a really important one. He says, not everyone is worthy and prepared for this. A person requires great care that he not be considered glad at calamity. A purity of heart is needed for this mitzvah, more than that which is needed for all the other mitzvot of the Torah. So it's interesting. He then goes on he's talking about the celebration at the Red Sea. And he says they could celebrate because they had reached the highest level of prophecy. But we have to be quite careful. And he says that their hatred for evildoers, the people at the Red Sea, was a hatred for evil, a pure and simple hatred that is appropriate for fearers and lovers of God. But we need to be very careful where we take that to. In other words, if we are rejoicing at what becomes death, then in fact, and I think this goes to what Rabbi Sachs talks about in his, and he speaks about it often, this idea of this love of life, and that Judaism is a religion of love, but it's also a religion of life. And indeed, we are told in Devarim, choose life. Life is the most important thing to us, not death. And so if we use death as the impetus for a party, shall we say, what is the message that we are sending ourselves inside our characters, but as well out there in terms of turning death into really making it a cult?
So, fine. I won't have it on the day that he died. Similar to Purim. Like, we didn't do it on the day that we hanged Haman or his sons or the day. And you can see that there, that it was specifically the day after. That's why Shushan Purim is on the 15th, because they fought for an extra day.
Right.
But then I'll still have my party or celebration, maybe not on the day, to avoid what you're raising over there. But I think if you look around the world at the moment, the opposite is the problem. The opposite is the reality that we faced is a total inversion of morals, where the people who are celebrating, and you have a Professor Columbia who said it was an amazing day. It was a fantastic day. It was a day of huge relief and joy to see people going over a border and raping and killing women and children. Now, that professor's still teaching.
Right.
At Columbia. We need to have a space where we can stand up and say the exact opposite. He's praising a death cult. We're not praising the death cult. I hear what you are saying, to focus too much on the death of a particular individual. Fine. I still want my party. I'll shift the day. But I think, and the nature of the party, I'm prepared to shift that as well, and maybe to mitigate, not full praise, part praise. But I think that we have an obligation to speak out against exactly that. They're praising death, and they're getting applause worldwide. We should be praising life. You know, Golda Meir, very famously, it's apocryphal, apparently, she didn't really say it, is that peace will come when the Arabs love their children more than they hate us. And apocryphal or not, I think it does encapsulate exactly the point that you mentioned. And I think that if we don't make those days and send out those, not just reactively, but proactively, saying these are our values. We are happy and praising that we are alive, and we're praising that, thank God, not too many of the enemy were killed, and we are glad that they've managed to survive the onslaught of this murderous, evil regime, and we hope this regime goes because we praise life. And there's no voice like that out there at the moment in this postmodern world. Because we've been defined as white oppressors. Therefore, our blood runs. Now, it's so interesting what Jews have been throughout the world. You know, today we're white oppressors. 100 years ago, we were communists and too black for the Aryan race in Germany. I mean, it's just like proper chameleons in every generation. There's this reason you can kill Jews. But at the end of the day, I think we need to find a time to stand up. I also think that there's something else we need to say. That the Maharal of Prague mentions, he says one of the reasons that Korach and his whole group were swallowed up in the earth is because it showed that there's certain views that are counter to the very bedrock that Hashem implanted in the cosmos, and therefore they winked out of existence to show that those views are incompatible with how the world is meant to be. And in this case, we need, as a Jewish people, to be standing up and saying, these views are incompatible with moral life.
Exactly.
Incompatible.
And so in that case, I would say that there's a chiyuv to celebrate. We just have to manage it. Because
So you agree with me now?
Not really, because we're not supposed to, but because we need to be seen to be standing for that moral line. Because what are we celebrating? We're not celebrating death.
Which is what they do.
Which is what they're doing. We're celebrating justice.
Justice, Hashem's providence.
Justice is seen to be done, because in a world where it got very murky on October 7th and further to say, where is God? Where is justice? When there is justice, we may not ignore that.
So no big party, no handing out sweets on the day.
Right.
But you'll concede that we do need to wave the flag of these ideas, and the question is how we do it so that we're correctly broadcasting internally as well as externally the messages and values.
The messages and values behind that celebration or around that celebration.
Right, l'chaim.
And indeed, l'chaim, which if you think about it, is the Jewish cheers, but really means to life.
To life.
So on that note, I think what we've discussed here, as you can see, has many different angles. But the main issue here was the fact that we could sit down and we could discuss it. We could bring different views. And really, who says what is not really what was the important thing, as opposed to bringing out a full discussion and a full machloket l'shem shamayim, which brings further wisdom and further understanding into the world, as opposed to reading just that little black and white headline, of course, which is the problem of today. So this really does demonstrate a devotion to truth, but at the same time, not just my truth, but a truth that spreads wider and further and higher.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed. We'd love you to subscribe by clicking here, and you can see in the description, you'll be able to get the link to access the notes and the learning program and the source sheets. And we'd love to encourage you to use those, as I said before, at a Shabbat table, at any other space, to really spread this machloket l'shem shamayim, this discussion for the sake of heaven, to engage thoughtfully on the Torah, in the Torah, through the Torah, in order to, as Ilana said, really ensure that our understanding deepens. And most importantly, this is quintessentially what the Jewish people are about. This really brings unity. This brings a space where we can talk to each other. And that's one of the goals that we have through Two Jews and a Scotch, that we talk more to and with each other, understand each other, particularly given the challenges we've experienced and those that are upcoming. Thank you for joining us.